They say the man in the mountains is no longer human, that he killed 7 bandits with his bare hands, that no one who goes near there ever lives to tell the tale. But Eliza Boone, the woman the whole town just laughs at, has no choice. She has to go up the mountain. She has to meet the monster. And what she finds there will change everything, not just her life, but this wild mountain region forever. Like, comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far my story has progressed, and follow so you don't miss the ending. The Bitterstone Mountains did not care about you. That was the first thing anyone who had ever tried to live near them would tell you if they were in a generous enough mood to talk about it at all. The peaks didn't care whether you were a good person or a bad one, whether you had a family depending on you or had burned every bridge you'd ever crossed. The cold came in off those ridges the same way every autumn, without warning, without mercy, and with a kind of indifference that felt almost personal once you'd been on the receiving end of it long enough. The town of Black Hollow sat at the base of the eastern approach to those mountains, close enough that on clear mornings you could see the snow line from the main street, close enough that the wind off the peaks rattled the windows of every building from September through April. It was not a prosperous town. It had never been prosperous. It had the stubborn, dug-in quality of a place that kept existing simply because the people in it had nowhere better to go. A general store that doubled as a post office, a livery stable that smelled the way livery stables smell, a saloon that was louder than its customer count warranted, and a scattering of houses along 2 dirt roads that turned to mud in the spring and froze solid in the winter. The people of Black Hollow were not, as a rule, cruel. They were just bored and frightened and anxious in the way that people are anxious when they don't have enough money and don't have enough certainty and need somewhere to put all that nervous energy. They found places to put it. They always did. One of those places, for several years running, had been Eliza Boone. She was 29 years old and had lived in Black Hollow her entire life, first in her father's house, and then, after his death, in the small room above the general store that she rented from old Harlan Pruitt, who had the good manners to pretend he didn't hear the comments people made about her when she was nearby. She was heavy. Noticeably, unmistakably heavy. Not in the soft-spoken way that people sometimes described as stout or well-fed, but genuinely, substantially heavy in a way that had drawn commentary her entire life, first from children who didn't know better, and later from adults who did and said it anyway. She had learned to live with it the way you learn to live with a bad knee. Not without pain, not without accommodation, but without letting it stop her from moving. She walked with a deliberate, unhurried stride. She did not hunch. She looked people in the eye. These were small victories, and she knew they were small, but she kept them anyway because there was no one else around to offer her larger ones. The humiliation of the wedding had happened 14 months ago, and Black Hollow had not let her forget it once. His name had been Thomas Caldwell, and he had seemed for about 8 months to be a man who saw her rather than her size. He was a dry goods trader who passed through Black Hollow twice a year, and they had written letters in between, and she had been stupid enough, or hopeful enough, which sometimes came to the same thing, to believe that the letters meant what they said. The ceremony had been arranged for a Saturday in late September. She had worn a dress she'd spent 3 months making. She had stood at the front of the church with Reverend Marsh and the handful of people who'd come, and she had waited. Thomas Caldwell never came through the door. He had sent a note instead, delivered by the livery boy with the pained expression of someone who knew the contents and wished he didn't. The note was short. It cited vague incompatibilities. It did not mention her weight directly. Thomas Caldwell was not quite brave enough for that particular honesty, but it didn't have to. The women in the back pew had already started murmuring before the boy finished handing over the paper. By supper time, the story had traveled the full length of Black Hollow's 2 main streets and back again, and by the following morning it had acquired the embellishments that small-town gossip always acquires. That she had wept publicly, that she had shouted, that she had made a scene. She had done none of those things. She had read the note, folded it carefully, placed it in her coat pocket, thanked Reverend Marsh for his time, and walked home. But the version where she had wept and shouted was more satisfying, so that was the version that stuck. Since then, she had been the subject of a specific, low-grade, persistent cruelty that never quite rose to the level of something you could confront directly. It lived in half-smiles and redirected conversations, in the way women at the dry goods counter found reasons to look away when she walked in, and the particular quality of silence that fell over a group when she approached. Once, she had overheard a girl of maybe 16 telling a friend that she would rather die than end up like Eliza Boone. The girl had not known she was listening. Eliza had walked past without pausing, entered the store, bought what she came for, and gone home and sat for a while with her hands flat on the table, pressing them hard against the wood until the surface's solidity reminded her that she was still there. She still had the note from Thomas Caldwell. She kept it in the tin box under her cot, along with the few other things she thought of as hers. Her father's watch, a letter from a cousin in Missouri she'd never met, $32 in paper money. She was not sure why she kept the note. Sometimes she thought it was to remind herself that she had survived it. Sometimes she thought it was to keep herself from forgetting that hope, offered carelessly, could land like a fist. It was on a Thursday in late October, the kind of day where the cold had settled in for good and the sky was the flat blank gray of old tin, that Harlan Pruitt knocked on her door and told her about the job. "Come in," she said, and he came in and stood near the window because there was only one chair and she was sitting in it. Harlan was 63 years old, built like a fence post that had survived several bad winters, and had the quality of a man who said what he meant without particular decoration. "There's work," he said. "Mountain work. Pays good." "What kind of work?" "Supply delivery. 3 trips between now and first snow, up to the homesteads on the eastern ridge. The Morrow place, the Callaways, a few others." He paused. "And Voss?" She looked at him. "I know," he said. "No," she said. "Eliza, no." She stood up, which in the small room meant she was now about 2 feet from him. "Harlan, I appreciate you thinking of me, but I am not going up to Garrick Voss's land." Harlan looked at the ceiling briefly, the way he did when he was deciding how direct to be. He landed on direct. "You need the money." She did not answer, which was its own kind of answer. "And the other families up there need the supplies," he continued. "The man I usually send quit last month. Said he'd rather starve than go back. The Morrows have 3 children, Eliza. The Callaways have an old man with a bad lung." She sat back down. "What happened to the man who quit?" "Scared off. Voss came out of his cabin with a rifle and told him to turn around and not come back. And you want me to try instead?" "I want someone to try instead. You were—" He paused again. "You were the only one who said yes." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the gap between the buildings with a sound like something drawing a slow breath. "What's the pay?" he told her. It was more than she made in 2 months of piecework. "I'll need a good horse," she said. "You'll have one. And I'm not going alone the first time. I'll go with the Morrow delivery first, learn the route, then handle the others." "Fine. And if Voss comes out with a rifle, you turn around," Harlan said immediately. "No supply run is worth—" "I was going to say I'll need to know the best angle of approach so he can see me coming from a distance." She looked up at him. "I don't intend to surprise the man." Harlan studied her for a moment. "You know the stories. I know some of them. They say he's killed men." "I've heard that." "They say he's not—" Harlan chose the word carefully. "Not right. In the head. That the war did something to him, or before the war something was already wrong, and the mountains just finished the job." Eliza looked at the window, at the gray sky beyond it. "People say a lot of things about people they've never met," she said. "Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're not." Harlan left her alone with it. She sat for a long time until the room got dark enough that she had to light the lamp. Then she opened the tin box under her cot, counted the $32 without really needing to count them, put them back, and lay down on the cot with her boots still on and stared at the ceiling. In the morning, she would say yes. The stories about Garrick Voss had started, as far as anyone in Black Hollow could reconstruct, about 6 years before the present autumn. He had arrived in the Bitterstone region without announcement or explanation, bought a large tract of land on the eastern ridge from a previous owner who was reportedly relieved to sell, and built a structure on it that people who had glimpsed it from a distance described as less of a house and more of a fortification, heavy timber walls, a second-story lookout, a fence line that was more about keeping things out than keeping animals in. Before that, the fragments were disputed and partial. Some people said he had been a soldier, and the way he moved and the way he assessed a situation from a distance seemed to support this, but no one knew which side or which battles. Some said he had been a lawman somewhere east of the territories, that he had run down killers for hire until something had gone wrong and he'd walked away from it. Some said it was simpler than that he had always been violent, that there was nothing in his past that explained it because it didn't need explaining, that some men were just built wrong. What everyone agreed on was the scar. It started somewhere above his left ear and came down across his cheekbone and jaw in a wide, pale ridge of skin that had healed badly, which meant whoever had done it had not been trying to make it clean. It pulled the left side of his face slightly, made his expression hard to read at the best of times, and gave him, in the reports of people who had been unfortunate enough to stand close to him, a quality of something that had gone through serious damage and come out the other side not quite the same shape. He was also large in the way that some men who have done sustained physical labor become large, not bulked up artificially, but densely, thoroughly solid, like wood that has dried out slowly until there is very little give left in it. He was over 6 feet, and he moved in the way that men who have learned to be careful about how much space they take up sometimes move, deliberately, without waste, as if every action was considered before it happened. He had driven off 4 separate groups of people who had attempted to either settle near his land or pass through it uninvited. The accounts varied on how exactly he had done this. Rifles were mentioned, as was fencing wire strung at inconvenient heights, as was simply appearing in front of people at unexpected moments and saying nothing until they left. 2 of the accounts involved physical violence, though the details were uncertain enough that it was difficult to say who had started what. One involved a horse left at the boundary of his property with its rider's hat placed carefully on the saddle, which was either a threat or a strange kind of courtesy, depending on how you read it. What he did not do, and this was the part that struck Eliza as she lay on her cot in the dark, listening to the wind, was hurt the mountain settlers. The families on the eastern ridge, the Morrows, the Calloways, the Hendersons further up, had been there for years, some of them since before Voss arrived, and not one of them had reported trouble from him. Old Mabel Calloway, who had a reputation for honesty that bordered on the uncomfortable, had said in Harlan's store once that Voss had mended a section of her fence after a spring storm, that she had found it done one morning without any announcement or request. Nobody had asked him to. Eliza lay on her cot and turned this over. Monsters, in her experience, did not mend fences. Waltz. She went with the first delivery on a Monday, riding a steady gray mare that Harlan had sourced from the livery and packed with enough weight that the horse moved at a rolling walk rather than any faster gait. They were 3 people, herself, a teenager named Cal, who knew the mountain roads, and an older man named Guest, who had done 2 previous deliveries and drew the line at going near Voss's property, but was willing to show her the routes. The first part of the climb was rough, but not dangerous. A switchback trail through pine forest that opened periodically onto views of the valley below, Black Hollow reduced to a gray smear along the base of the eastern foothills. The cold was serious up here, in a way it wasn't in town, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself but simply accumulated until you noticed your hands had gotten clumsy and your thinking had gotten slow. The Morrow homestead was the first stop, a low log house with a solid roof and a barn that looked newer than the house, which suggested someone had learned from experience what mattered. Clara Morrow came out to meet them before they had fully dismounted, 3 children arranged in a loose cluster behind her like a litter of cautious animals, and the quality of her relief when she saw the packed horse was so raw that Eliza had to look at the horizon for a moment to give the woman some dignity. "We weren't sure anyone was coming," Clara said. She was maybe 35, angular-faced, with the kind of tired that doesn't entirely go away with sleep. "Marcus said he'd ride down if we didn't see someone by the end of the week." Harlan had trouble finding a person willing to do the route, Eliza said, carefully neutral. She started unloading without being asked. "He found one now." Clara looked at her with that particular look that women sometimes gave each other when the subtext was, "I know exactly what you just said." "You're the Boone woman," she said. "I am." "I heard about Clara stopped. "Most people have," Eliza said. She handed a sack of flour to the nearest child, who accepted it with both arms and staggered impressively toward the house. It doesn't get more interesting with retelling. Clara Morrow, to her credit, laughed, a short, genuine sound. No, I suppose it doesn't. She took a wrapped bundle from the pack herself and started for the barn. You going up to Voss's place? That's the plan. He knows you're coming? Harlan sent word through the Calloways. Whether Voss reads it as permission or warning, I couldn't say. Probably neither, Clara said, ducking into the barn. He doesn't frighten easily, but he's not unreasonable. He just... She paused, set the bundle down, came back out squinting in the light. He doesn't trust quick. He's not the kind of man who does anything quick except react to something going wrong. You give him enough time, and he's... She looked for the word. He's not what the stories say. You've talked to him? Twice. Both times about grazing lines. Both times he said about 12 words and spent the rest of the conversation looking at me like he was trying to figure out if I was about to do something stupid. She smiled slightly. When he figured out I wasn't, he relaxed some. Eliza filed this away. What 12 words? Something about the fence line the first time, something about the spring runoff the second. Clara glanced at her sideways. He doesn't talk unless he has something specific to say. That threw me the first time. But not the second. No, Clara said. By the second time, I decided it was actually kind of refreshing. Tut. The Calloway place was further up, accessible by a narrower track that had been hacked into the hillside at some point in the past and had been maintained by use rather than effort. Jonas Calloway was 68 and did have a bad lung. You could hear it when he breathed, a wet rattle that suggested things were not improving. But he was alert and deliberate and helped unload with a precision that spoke to someone who did not like accepting help but had made a practical peace with it. Voss knows you're coming, Jonas confirmed when Eliza asked. He handed the message paper back to her. Short, written in a hand she didn't recognize, probably Harlan's. Sent my boy up with it 2 days past. Voss read it, gave no answer, which means he'll receive you. He looked at her steadily. You understand what I mean by that. He won't drive me off, Eliza said. He just won't tell me he won't. Right. Is there anything else I should know about approaching his land? Jonas looked at the trail above them, where the pines thinned and the rock became more visible, the mountain showing its structure through the greenery. He'll hear you before he sees you. He's got a method of knowing when someone's on his lower track. I don't know what it is, tripwires or experience, both maybe. By the time you see the cabin, he'll know you're there. He paused. Don't stop moving when you see him. People who stop are people who are deciding whether to run. Men who might run make him tense. What if I need to stop to unload? Then stop to unload. Just don't stop to think about whether you're scared. What if I am scared? Jonas considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Keep moving anyway, he said finally. He'll know the difference, and so will you. She went up alone. Jest and Cal stayed at the Calloway place, and she took the gray mare and the remaining supplies, flour, dried goods, 2 wrapped bundles she hadn't been told the contents of, a small crate of something that clinked, up the trail that Jonas had pointed her toward. The trail changed character above the Calloway homestead. Below, it had been worn enough by regular passage to feel like an actual road, however rough. Up here it was more suggestion than fact. 2 slightly depressed lines through rock and root where something heavy had passed repeatedly, bordered by brush that closed in from both sides. The mare picked her way carefully, ears moving with each new sound from the trees. The wind was different up here. It moved in longer, slower patterns, interrupted by the rock faces above, that channeled it into unexpected pressures. She could hear it in the pines, a low, sustained note that would have been almost musical if it hadn't been so cold. She was thinking about Jonas Calloway's instruction, don't stop moving, when she came around a granite outcrop and the cabin appeared. It was not what she had expected, and then it was entirely what she had expected. The core structure was heavy timber, 2 stories, built on a natural shelf of rock that gave it height over the approach without requiring any additional construction. A second section had been added at some point, lower, longer, maybe a workshop or a stable, connecting to the main structure by a short covered passage. The fence line came down from the upper slope and angled around the front of the property in a way that was less about enclosure and more about definition. This is mine. This is where mine starts. She kept the mare moving. The man was already outside when she cleared the last stand of pines. He was standing at the corner of the fence, not at the gate, standing sideways to her, which she registered as deliberate, as a posture that said, "I see you, but I'm not facing you down," that she thought was probably the closest thing to welcome she was going to get. He was as large as the stories said. She had prepared herself for the scar, and she still noticed it more than she wanted to. The way the pale ridge pulled slightly at the corner of his left eye, the way it changed the whole weight of his face. He was wearing a heavy coat over what looked like several layers underneath, his hands visible at his sides, and he was watching her with an expression that was not hostile, but was not particularly welcoming either. It was assessment. It was the way you looked at something you weren't sure about yet. She stopped the mare at the gate because that was the logical place to stop, and met his eyes. "Mr. Voss," she said, "I'm Eliza Boone. Harlan Pruitt's General Store in Black Hollow. I have your monthly supplies." He said nothing for a moment. His eyes moved over the packed mare, over her, over the trail behind her with a comprehensiveness that was not paranoia, but was clearly habit. "You're alone," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, and less rough. The kind of voice that had volume to spare and didn't need to use it to be heard. "The other two stayed at the Callaways," she said. "The trail up here's too narrow for 3 horses, and Jest has a bad knee." He looked at her again. "Pruitt send you specifically, or were you the only one willing to come up here?" She almost laughed. It came out of nowhere, the directness of it, the absence of any attempt at social smoothing. "Both," she said. "He needed someone willing. I needed the money. Here we are." Something moved in his expression. Not quite amusement, but something adjacent to it. "Come through the gate," he said, and turned back toward the cabin without waiting to see if she would. She came through the gate. Unloading happened in the practical, efficient way of transactions that don't require conversation. She handed things down from the pack. He took them and stacked them or set them on the covered porch that ran along the front of the cabin. He was careful with the crate that clinked, which she appreciated, because she'd been trying to keep it balanced for the last half mile. He did not thank her, but he also did not behave as though she weren't there, which she supposed was a kind of courtesy. When the mare was unpacked, he set the last bundle on the porch and stood there looking at it for a moment. Then, without particular ceremony, he said, "You want something hot before you ride down." It was not quite a question. She was cold. She had been cold for 2 hours, and the afternoon light was already getting thin in the way that October light did up this high, and the ride down would be cold too. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Inside the cabin was warm. A serious fire and a stone hearth that was built into the back wall with the heavy pragmatism of someone who had thought hard about insulation and fuel efficiency. The room was large and divided by function rather than by walls. Near the fire, a table and 2 chairs. Against the far wall, a workbench covered with tools and something in disassembly she couldn't identify from across the room. Shelves on every available surface, holding what looked like a mixture of supplies and books. More books than she'd expected, spines facing out in the way of someone who actually read them. He put water on the fire and went to the workbench without asking her to sit, which she took as implicit permission to do so, and sat in the chair nearest the fire. The silence was not uncomfortable in the way she'd expected it to be. It was present, you were aware of it, but it didn't press. He worked at the bench, whatever he was doing requiring concentration, and she sat and got warm and looked around the room with the careful, non-judgmental attention of someone who had learned to read spaces. The books. She counted what she could see from where she sat, at least 40, maybe more behind them. History, she could read some of the spines. Maps, something about mineralogy. 3 novels she recognized, one she had read twice. "Whistler's Ridge," she said, before she thought about whether to say it. He turned from the bench. "The novel," she clarified. "I can see the spine from here. I've read it. The part where she finally leaves the town." She paused. "That part's very good." He looked at her for a long moment with the unreadable quality that Clara Morrow had described. Then he turned back to the bench. "Yes, he said. It is. She could not have said why this felt significant, but it did. The water heated. He made coffee from it. Real coffee, not the substitutes that were common in Black Hollow, and put a cup on the table without ceremony, then went back to the bench with his own. She drank it and got warm and did not try to fill the silence. When she set the empty cup down, he said from the bench, "You're coming back next month." "Yes." "Same route. Don't take the left fork past Calloway's upper fence. That path drops off on the right side and the edge is iced over." She looked at the table. "You know the paths." "I know my land. I'll take the right fork," she said. She thanked him for the coffee and left. He didn't follow her to the gate, but when she cleared the fence line and glanced back, he was standing in the doorway watching the trail. She couldn't tell, from that distance, whether he was making sure she left safely or making sure she left. She thought, riding down through the thinning afternoon light with the mare's breath making small clouds in the cold air, that it might have been both. She told Harlan only that Voss had received her and that she'd be going back the following month. Harlan looked at her over the edge of his ledger with the expression of a man who was choosing not to ask questions. "I'll need the route confirmed before next trip," she said. "Some of the upper trails are icing. I'll ask Jonas Calloway. He already told me. I'm just documenting it." Harlan wrote it in the ledger. "The other families, any problems?" "None. Clara Morrow's holding together. Jonas Calloway's lung is bad. The Henderson place I haven't reached yet. That's for the second trip." "Fine." He looked up. "You're not going to tell me anything interesting, are you?" "No," she said. "I'm going to do the job and come back and give you a report. That's what I agreed to." He almost smiled. "That's what you agreed to." She gathered her things and went upstairs to her room. Outside, the mountain was invisible in the dark, just a shape of blackness against a sky that still held a faint trace of gray in the west. She stood at the window and looked at it for a moment before lighting the lamp. She had met Garrick Voss, and he had not been what the stories said. She was not sure yet what he was, but she was going back, and she would figure it out. She was good at figuring things out when she gave herself enough time and enough cold hours in the saddle and enough silence in which to actually think. She lit the lamp. The mountain disappeared as the room brightened, her own reflection replacing it in the glass. She looked tired. She was tired, but underneath the tired, and this surprised her slightly, she was also something that she hadn't been in quite a while. She was interested. The second trip was 3 weeks later, in the second week of November, when the cold had stopped pretending to be temporary and committed to being the season. Cal rode with her as far as the Calloway place, and then turned back, and she went up the upper trail alone with the mare and the supplies, and the memory of Jonas Calloway's instructions still sharp enough to be useful. She took the right fork past Calloway's upper fence. She could see where the left fork went, and Jonas had been right. The edge dropped away on the right side of that path, and the ice on it was visible even from where she was, a gray shine in the flat morning light. Voss was at the fence again when she came through the last stand of pines. Same position as before, sideways, hands visible, watching without directly facing her. She had thought about this positioning during the 3 weeks between trips and had concluded it was the territorial equivalent of speaking quietly. "I know you're here. I'm not threatened. I'm also not pretending you're not there." She stopped at the gate and dismounted this time before speaking, because the mare had a stone in her left front shoe that needed attention, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "Mr. Voss, the horse is favoring her left front," he said. "I know. I need to check her shoe." She went to the mare's head and ran a hand down the left leg, picked up the hoof with the practiced motion of someone who had been doing this since childhood. The stone was lodged near the toe. She worked it out with her thumbnail and set the hoof down. When she looked up, Voss had moved to the gate and opened it, which she hadn't asked him to do. "Better?" he said. "Better." She led the mare through the gate. "Thank you for the fork information last time. The ice on the left path is worse than you described. It goes further than I expected." "It's been colder than usual." "It has." She began to unload. "I added to your order. Jonas Calloway mentioned you'd asked him for some specific items last summer, and he hadn't been able to source them. I wasn't sure if that was still relevant." He took the first bundle from her and looked at it. actually looked at it, turning it slightly in his hands. How did you know what I'd asked for? I asked him. I thought it was more useful to know before I came up here than to not know. He was quiet for a moment, and the way she had begun to understand was not absence of response, but actual consideration. Yes, he said finally, it's still relevant. They worked in the same efficient silence as before, and she went inside for coffee again, and he went back to the workbench. She noticed this time that what he was working on was a piece of mechanism, something that had once been a clock or something like one, spread out on the bench in its components with a precision that suggested someone who worked on things, not because they had to, but because they found the logic of it satisfying. She did not comment on it. She drank her coffee and looked at the books. There are 12 more in the back room, he said, without turning from the bench. If you're counting. She looked at the back of his head. I wasn't counting, she said. I was reading spines. For what purpose? Habit, mostly. I read what's available. In town, that's not much. Harlan has a few. Mrs. Marsh has a Bible and some domestic guides. The saloon keeps a stack of gazettes. She looked at the shelf nearest her. You have more books than everyone else in Black Hollow combined. He turned slightly. Not to look at her directly, more of a partial turn, as if she'd said something that he was processing sideways. Most of them came with the property. Previous owner was a reader. You didn't add any? A pause. Some, she pointed without getting up. The mineralogy one, and the 2 history volumes on the second shelf. Those have a different spine quality. Newer. He turned fully this time and looked at the shelf she was indicating, then back at her. It was a brief, assessing look. Not hostile, not warm, but something she couldn't entirely name. You have a good eye, he said. I pay attention, she said. It's not the same thing. He turned back to the bench. After a moment, quietly, he said, No, it isn't. She finished her coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up, and the pines were audible even through the thick walls. She was thinking about the ride down, about the ice on the trail, about whether Jonas Calloway's cough had sounded worse this trip than last, about the $32 in the tin box, and the new 30 that this trip had added to it. There's been talk in town, she said, and then stopped, unsure why she was saying it. He did not react visibly. There's always talk. About the mountain land, about a company buying up properties. She paused. I don't know details. I heard pieces. He set down whatever he was holding, a careful, deliberate motion. What pieces? That someone's been approaching homesteaders, offering money, that the offers aren't really offers, that there's pressure behind them. She looked at her hands around the cup. I don't know who. I don't know the name of the company. I heard it from guest who heard it from someone else, and by that point it was mostly rumor. He was still for a moment in the way that she had begun to understand meant he was doing several things simultaneously, processing what she'd said, evaluating its source, deciding what to do with it. Why are you telling me this? She considered the question. Because the Morrows and the Calloways haven't heard it, probably. And you're better positioned to assess whether it's real than I am. She met his eyes when he turned to look at her. And because you told me about the ice on the left fork, which probably saved me a broken horse leg. He looked at her for 3 full seconds. She counted, because it was an unusual amount of eye contact from a man who generally rationed it. Then he said, I'll look into it. I didn't say you should, she said. I said I thought you should know. I know the difference, he said. She put the cup down and stood up. Outside, the wind pressed against the cabin wall with a sound like something testing the seams. She pulled on her coat and her hat and thanked him, and he walked her to the gate without being asked, and she led the mare through and mounted and turned to look at him briefly. He was watching her with the same expression he'd had in the doorway last time, the one she hadn't been able to read. This time, she thought she could see a piece of it. Not just assessment, something closer to reluctance, as if he had decided something and was not sure how he felt about having decided it. She turned the mare down the trail and did not look back. The wind came off the peaks in long, cold waves all the way down to the valley, and by the time she reached Black Hollow, her face was numb, and her hands were stiff, and she had decided in the clear, uncomplicated way that comes from several hours of cold air and solitary thinking that Garrick Voss was not what the stories said. He was something else entirely, and she didn't have the right word for it yet. But she was going back, and she would figure it out. The third trip was the last one Harlan had originally contracted her for, and she made it in late November on a day when the sky had the particular low, heavy quality that meant snow within 24 hours. She pushed the pace on the lower trail, delivered to the Morrows and the Callaways faster than the previous trips, and was halfway up the upper track when it started. Not the dramatic blizzard kind of snow, but the quiet, determined kind, small flakes falling straight down in the still air between the pines, accumulating without fuss. Voss was not at the fence when she came through the last stand of trees. She stopped the mare at the gate and waited, because Jonas Calloway's instructions still held. Don't stop moving unless there's a reason to stop. Unloading was a reason. Standing at a closed gate was a reason. She waited and watched the cabin, and after about a minute the door opened and he came out, and she could tell from the way he was moving that something was different. He walked faster than usual, and he was looking past her at the trail behind rather than at her directly. "Anyone follow you up?" he said, reaching the gate. "No, what's wrong?" He looked at the trail a moment longer, then at her. "Come inside first." She tied the mare to the fence post. The animal would be fine for a few minutes, the snow was light still, and followed him in. The fire was lower than usual, which meant he'd been away from it for a while, busy with something else. There was a map on the table she hadn't seen before, spread open and weighted at the corners with whatever had been nearest. A coffee cup, a length of chain, 2 rocks. She looked at the map without touching it. It was a survey map of the Eastern Ridge, hand-annotated in several places with marks she couldn't immediately read. "The company's called Hargrove Land Syndicate," he said from behind her, "out of the Eastern Territories. They've been quietly buying or pressuring properties along this ridge for about 8 months. I didn't know it was them specifically until 2 weeks ago." She turned. "How did you find out?" "I went to Brentville." Brentville was the nearest town of any real size, 2 days' ride in good weather. "The county recorder's office has filings. I looked at them." He pulled out the second chair and sat down across the map from her, which was the most deliberate invitation to sit she'd gotten from him yet. She sat. "They've already acquired 3 properties further south. All homesteads, all bought at prices low enough that I'd guess the sellers didn't know what the land was worth." "What is it worth?" He pointed to a section of the map, the upper southern ridge, marked with one of his annotations. "There's a seam of coal under this section that runs north for roughly 6 miles. It comes closest to the surface here, which makes it extractable. Someone with enough capital could pull significant tonnage out of this mountain." He looked up. "Hargrove knows about it. The properties they've acquired sit directly above the southern end of the seam." Eliza looked at the map. The annotation made sense now, Shub. It wasn't random marks. It was the line of the seam as he'd estimated it, running like a slow curve through the eastern ridge, through the Morrow property, through the upper Callaway land, through the long stretch of the Henderson homestead above. Through Voss's land, clearly, which sat at the northern end. "They need all of it," she said. "The seam's only worth full extraction if they control the whole line. Individual sections are accessible but inefficient. They need continuous access from south to north." He sat back. "They've been quiet about it because once people know what's underneath, the price goes up and the willingness to sell goes down. And the pressure you mentioned, the things Guest had heard about, started getting less subtle recently. The Henderson boy, he's 19, runs the place alone since his father passed, had 2 armed men come to his door last month, told him they were representing a land company and that he'd be better off selling now than waiting." Voss's jaw tightened slightly. "He told them to leave. They left. But they'll be back." She looked at the map again, at the annotated line running through properties where she knew exactly who lived, exactly what they had, exactly what they'd lose. Clara Morrow's 3 children. Jonas Calloway's bad lung and his refusal to be anywhere but his own land. The Henderson boy, alone on his father's homestead. "You've been sitting on this for 2 weeks," she said. "I've been trying to determine the full scope before doing anything with it." "Have you told the families?" "Not yet." She looked at him. He was watching her with the contained, careful expression she'd learned was not coldness, but the face of someone who weighed things before releasing them into the world. Why not? Because telling frightened people that they're being targeted without also telling them what to do about it makes things worse, not better. He paused. I needed to know the full picture first. And now you do? Enough of it. She looked at the map one more time, then at him. Outside, the snow was coming down with slightly more purpose now, ticking against the window glass. What do you need? She said. He didn't answer immediately. She thought he was going to deflect, to say something non-committal, to maintain the distance he'd maintained across all 3 visits. But instead, he looked at the map and then back at her with an expression that was less guarded than anything she'd seen on him yet. Not open exactly, but something had shifted slightly, some internal calculation completed. I need someone who can talk to the families without scaring them, he said. Clara Morrow will receive information better from you than from me. Jonas Calloway. He'll understand the land survey argument, but he needs to hear it in a way that doesn't sound like a threat. He paused. I'm not good at that. I noticed, she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth that wasn't quite a smile. The Henderson boy is easier. He's already angry, he just needs direction. But the Morrows and the Calloways are the critical ones. If they panic and sell, the others follow. And if they hold, then Hargrove has to either significantly raise their offers or change their strategy. He looked at the map. We have until spring. That's roughly when they'll move from pressure to something harder. She stayed longer than usual that day. The snow came down steadily outside and the fire built back up, and they sat on opposite sides of the map while he went through what he'd found in the county filings, the property boundaries, the transfer records, the names of the intermediaries Hargrove had used to obscure their involvement in the early purchases. He was precise with information. He gave her what was documented and said clearly when something was inference rather than fact, which she appreciated more than she could easily articulate, because most men she'd encountered presented their guesses with the same confidence as their certainties and considered it a strength. You wrote all this down? She said at one point, looking at the notes he'd made in the margins of the survey map. It's easier to see whole when it's on paper. And the seam information, how do you know it's accurate? I know minerals, he said, which was not quite an explanation, but was said with the flatness of someone who had earned the right to say it without elaboration. She looked at the mineralogy volumes on his shelf and decided to accept it. When she finally stood to go, the snow outside had lightened again, which would make the trail down manageable. He walked her to the gate in the by-now familiar way, and she mounted and turned to him and said what she'd been thinking since about halfway through the conversation. I'll come back next week, she said, with or without a contract from Harlan. I'll talk to the Morrows and the Calloways on the way up. He looked at her steadily. You don't have to. I know. She settled in the saddle. I also didn't have to warn you about the talk in town last month. I did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. He was quiet for a moment. You'll need better gear for the upper trail if you're riding it regularly in winter. The cold gets worse above the Calloway line. I'll manage. I have a spare coat, he said. Heavy. Better insulation than what you're wearing. She looked at him. He was not looking at her directly. He was looking at the mare's withers, at the middle distance, at whatever spot a person looks at when they're saying something they're slightly uncomfortable saying. Thank you, she said, and meant it without making it more than it was. He went inside and came back with a coat that was too large for her by a significant measure, but was, as advertised, heavily lined. She tied it across the saddle for now and looked down at him from the mare's back. One more thing, she said. The supply runs. Harlan contracted 3, and I've done 3. He'll try to end the arrangement now that winter's in. And the family still needs supplies through winter, and you may need information I can get in town that you can't get from up here. She met his eyes. I'm saying I'd like to keep coming up, if you're willing to receive me. He looked at her for the 3-second count she'd come to expect before he said anything that mattered. You know what people in Black Hollow will say, he said, about a woman making regular trips up here alone. People in Black Hollow, she said evenly, have been saying things about me for 14 months. I've survived it so far. The expression that had been hovering at the corner of his mouth finally resolved into something definite. Brief, contained, but real. Then yes, he said. Come back. She rode down through the snowlight with the big coat roped to the saddle and the map she'd memorized still clear in her mind. The line of the coal seam curving north through other people's futures. By the time she reached the valley and Black Hollow's gray rooftops appeared through the thinning trees, she had already begun thinking about what to say to Clara Morrow, how to frame it for Jonas Calloway, what angle would reach the Henderson boys' anger without feeding it the wrong direction. She had a week to work it out. She would work it out. Harlan looked up from his ledger when she came through the store door, cold-reddened and carrying the unfamiliar coat, and opened his mouth to say something about the end of the contract. She set the coat on the counter and started before he could. I'm continuing the mountain runs through winter, she said. I'll cover my own horse costs. You can give me a partial rate or nothing. It's your choice. But I need you to keep receiving my reports because some of what I'm finding out up there is going to matter. Harlan looked at the coat, then at her. What kind of matter? The kind that involves other people's land and a company that doesn't want them to know what's under it. He was quiet for a moment. Harlan Pruitt, whatever his faults, understood certain things about Black Hollow's relationship with the mountain families, understood that the town depended on them in small, regular ways that everyone took for granted until they stopped. Partial rate, he said finally, and I want to know what you know. You'll know when I know enough to be useful, she said, which was not quite what he'd asked for, and he accepted it because it was what she had. She went upstairs to her room and hung the oversized coat on the door hook, where it took up more space than anything else in the room. She was cold and tired, and her left knee ached from the saddle hours. And tomorrow she would write down everything from the map while it was still precise in her memory. She would make her own notes. She would organize what she knew against what she needed to find out. Outside the window, the last of the snow had stopped, and the mountain was clear and dark against the sky, present, immovable, indifferent in the way mountains are indifferent, which is to say, completely and without any malice in it. She looked at it for a while. What Garrick Voss had built up there, she thought, he had built to last. The families on that ridge had built the same way. And Hargrove Land Syndicate, with its county filings and its armed intermediaries and its careful secrecy, had made the mistake of assuming that things built to last were also easy to move. She turned from the window and lit the lamp and sat down to write. The notes Eliza had written that night filled 4 pages by the time she stopped, and she read them back in the morning with the cold, sober eye of someone checking their own work for holes. The holes were there. She didn't know the full extent of Hargrove's capital, didn't know who their legal representation was, didn't know whether the county recorder in Brentville was on their payroll or simply indifferent. These were things Voss hadn't been able to determine from the filings alone, and she couldn't determine them from Black Hollow either. What she could do was talk to people. She spent the better part of the following week doing exactly that. Not directly, not in ways that announced what she was looking for, but in the patient lateral way she'd learned over years of being someone people underestimated. She let conversations happen in Harlan's store. She asked questions that sounded like idle curiosity and listened to the answers with more attention than she showed. She found out that a land agent named Doyle Fitch had passed through Black Hollow twice in the past 4 months, that he had drinks at the saloon and asked questions of his own, and that he had left both times without satisfying whatever he'd come for. She also found out that he was expected back in December. She wrote this in her notes and went up to the mountain on the following Thursday with the information and the cold coat and the specific purposefulness that had become, she realized, the dominant feeling of her days. The sense of moving towards something rather than simply enduring where she was. Voss read her notes without comment, then set them on the map table and looked at the ceiling briefly in the way she'd come to understand meant he was integrating what she'd brought with what he already had. Fitch, he said. He's not Hargrove directly. He's a freelance agent, Haki. They use him to make initial contact, so their name doesn't appear until the sale is already agreed. You know him? I know the type. He looked at her. He'll come to the mountain families directly when he comes back. He'll present it as a straightforward business transaction. And if they say no, then whoever comes after Fitch won't be presenting anything. He moved to the window, looked out at the snow on the upper slope. I've seen this before, Not coal, timber, once, a long time ago. Different company, same approach. First they buy what they can buy easy, then they pressure what won't sell easy. Then he stopped. Then what? He turned from the window. Then they make staying less viable than leaving. She sat with this for a moment. We need the families to understand what's happening before Fitch gets to them. Yes. And we need them to agree to hold, collectively, because if even one sells, the others start to wonder if they've read it wrong, he finished. And wondering is how it starts. They went together to the Morrow homestead that afternoon. Voss's first time coming down from his own property to another family's land in what Clara Morrow later said was at least 2 years. Clara opened the door and looked at the two of them on her porch with an expression that moved through several stages before settling on something Eliza read as cautious relief, the way a person looks when something they half expected turns out to be true. They sat at Clara's table and Eliza laid it out. The coal seam, the Hargrove filings, Fitch, the timeline. She spoke plainly and watched Clara's face move through the information without rushing it. Clara listened without interrupting, which Eliza had not been entirely sure she would, and when Eliza finished, Clara was quiet for a moment and then said, "How much coal are we talking about?" "Enough that a company out of the Eastern Territories is spending significant money to acquire 6 miles of mountain land quietly," Voss said. He had said almost nothing during Eliza's summary, had sat at the far end of the table with his hands flat in front of him in a posture that was, for him, almost relaxed. "Which means the value is well above any price they'd offer you. And if we sell, they extract, they profit, and you have whatever they paid you and no land." He paused. "If you hold, and they are eventually forced to negotiate properly, the number is different." Clara looked at her hands. Her oldest child, a boy of maybe 10, had appeared in the doorway from the back room and was listening with the specific attentiveness of children who understand they are witnessing something important. Clara noticed him and didn't send him away. "Marcus is going to want to know all of this," she said. Marcus was her husband, who had been at the lower pasture when they arrived. "He's going to want to know it from both of you, not just from me telling him later." "We'll wait," Eliza said. They waited. Marcus Morrow came in from the pasture 20 minutes later with the weather-beaten look of a man who had been working in cold that didn't care what he thought about it, and he listened to the summary with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and at the end he said, "And Voss thinks we can hold." "I think you have enough to hold if you do it together," Voss said. "If any family decides separately that the offer's better than the risk, the rest of you lose leverage." He looked at Marcus directly. "I'm not asking you to take my word for it. I'm asking you to look at the filing documents yourself, which I have copies of, and decide based on what's written." Marcus looked at Voss for a long moment. The particular look that men give each other when they are deciding how much weight to assign to another man's word. Then he said, "All right, show me." The Jonas Calloway conversation was harder. Not because Jonas didn't understand. He understood it faster than Clara and Marcus combined, his mind still sharp under the failing lung. But because Jonas was 68 years old and had been on that land for 31 years and had watched it almost take him several times and had stayed anyway, and the idea that someone from the Eastern Territories thought they could move him off it with a land agent and some paperwork landed differently in a man like that. He got quiet in a way that was not the productive quiet of someone thinking, but the white-edged quiet of someone managing anger. "Jonas," Eliza said, carefully. "I heard you," he said. His voice was level. "I'm not going anywhere. I just need a minute." She gave him the minute. "My wife built that kitchen," he said when the minute was up. "She died in that house. My son was born in it." He looked at Voss. "They send someone up here to buy me off my own land. They better bring more men than they've got." "That's the version of this I'm trying to avoid," Voss said. "Armed confrontation without legal standing ends one way." "And with legal standing?" "Better." Voss pulled out the copies of the county filings he'd brought. "The transfers Hargrove has already executed. 2 of them have procedural problems. The boundary descriptions don't match the original survey. That's contestable in a territorial court, which means their existing acquisitions aren't as clean as they think." He laid the documents on Jonas's table. If we can document the pressure they put on the families that sold, combined with the filing errors, we have enough to bring before the circuit judge. Jonas looked at the documents. He looked at them for a long time, reading carefully, the wet rattle in his chest audible in the quiet cabin. "You're a thorough man," he said finally. "When something matters," Voss said. They visited the Henderson boy, Danny Henderson, 19, with his father's stubbornness in him and not quite enough of his father's patience. On the second day, riding up to the topmost homestead through a wind that came off the highest peaks with a serious personal intensity. Danny was already angry before they arrived. 2 men had come back, he told them. Not Fitch, different men, bigger, who had stood in his doorway and told him the offer was time-limited and that waiting would not be in his interest. "What did you tell them?" Eliza asked. "I told them to get off my property," Danny said. He was pacing the small room, unable to hold still. "I told them if they came back, I'd make it difficult for them to leave." "Danny." She waited until he stopped pacing and looked at her. "I understand. But if you do that, they use it. They'll say you're unstable, they'll get a magistrate involved, they'll make the legal question about your conduct instead of theirs." She kept her voice level. "Their strategy works best if you react, so don't react." He stared at her. "So I do nothing?" "You do exactly what we tell you, which is document everything. Write down the date, the names, if you got them, what they said, what you said. You keep that record." She looked at him steadily. "And you hold. Because if you hold, and the Morrows hold, and the Calloways hold, Hargrove's timeline collapses." Danny Henderson was quiet for a moment. He had the expression of someone who wanted very badly to do something physical about a problem that required patience instead, which Eliza recognized as one of the more difficult emotional positions a person could be in. "And Voss is in on this," he said. "You're both in on this." "Yes," she said. He looked at Voss, who had been standing near the door with his characteristic stillness. "You've been up here alone for 6 years," Danny said. "Why now?" Voss took a moment before answering. "Because now it's relevant to other people," he said. "I'm not interested in causes. I'm interested in this specific situation where specific people I have some regard for are about to lose things they shouldn't have to lose." Danny looked at him for a long moment. Then he sat down, which was its own kind of answer. December came in hard, the way December did in the Bitterstone region, not gradually but decisively, as if the season had been waiting behind a door and finally pushed it open all at once. The snow that had been occasional became constant. The trails that had been difficult became genuinely dangerous, and the cold at the upper elevations reached the kind of temperatures that changed the terms of everything. Eliza came up twice in December, both times with Cal riding as far as the Callaway Junction, both times wearing the heavy coat that had become, without any formal acknowledgement, part of her regular gear. Doyle Fitch came to Black Hollow in the second week of December, as expected. He was a compact, well-dressed man in his 40s with an easy manner that Eliza suspected worked well on people who hadn't been warned about him. He spent 2 nights at the saloon, had several conversations, and rode out toward the mountain on the 3rd morning. She followed him, at distance, to the Morrow Junction, far enough to confirm his direction, close enough to see him turn up the mountain trail. She turned back to town and sent a message to Voss through Jonas Calloway's son, who rode the lower trails daily regardless of weather because young men with horses don't let winter make their decisions. The message was 2 words. Fitch came. What happened on that mountain visit, Eliza pieced together later from Clara Morrow's account, from Danny Henderson's written record, and from what Voss told her directly, which was sparse but precise. Fitch had gone to each homestead in turn, the Morrows first, then the Calloways, then Henderson, presenting what he described as a generous acquisition offer from an unnamed development company. Each family had declined. Each family had been, according to their own accounts, polite but absolute. At the Henderson property, Danny had written down Fitch's full name, the company he alluded to, and the specific language of the offer, particularly the phrase about the offer being time-sensitive, which Danny had recognized from Eliza's earlier briefing as the pressure language she'd warned him about. He gave Fitch nothing and recorded everything. What Fitch had not expected, apparently, was to find Voss at the Calloway property when he arrived there. He had not expected to find Voss anywhere on this route, which was probably part of why the visit went differently than Hargrove had planned it. Voss had said almost nothing, had sat at Jonas's table while Fitch made his presentation, had looked at Fitch with the flat, unhurried attention that made most men uncomfortable, and at the end had said, "The boundary descriptions in your company's existing purchase agreements are in error. You might want to inform your principals of that before they file anything further." Fitch had left faster than he'd arrived. He did not return to Black Hollow. A note sent to the county recorder's office in Brentville 3 weeks later. Eliza had drafted it, Voss had provided the legal citations. Jonas Calloway had signed it because he was the longest established property owner on the ridge, formally documented the boundary irregularities, and requested a review of the recent transfers. For 6 weeks after that, nothing happened. This was not comforting. Eliza had been paying enough attention to know that silence from a well-capitalized company was not retreat. It was planning. The families felt it too. She could hear it in the way Clara Morrow's voice had a new tightness when they talked, in the way Jonas's written responses to her letters got shorter and more careful, in the way Danny Henderson had stopped pacing and started watching, which was an improvement in one sense and concerning in another. January gave way to February. The snow was deep enough now that the upper trails were passable only for single horses moving carefully, and Eliza had learned the mountain's winter moods well enough to know when to push through and when to wait a day. She spent more time at Voss's cabin than she had originally intended. Sometimes the weather closed in on the return trip, and staying until morning was the practical decision, and she slept by the fire wrapped in the heavy coat while Voss took the back room. And in the morning, they drank coffee, and she read while he worked at the bench, and it had the quality of something that had settled into its own shape without either of them planning it. They talked more. Not always about Hargrove or the families or the legal filings, sometimes about the books on his shelf, about Black Hollow and what it had been like there before and after the wedding she'd mentioned once without elaborating, about the territory war he'd fought in that had given him the scar. He talked about the war the way people talk about things that are finished but not resolved. In short, factual sentences that didn't reach for meaning, but didn't avoid it either. "You don't have to tell me about it," she said once, when he'd stopped mid-sentence and looked at the fire. "I know." He stayed looking at the fire for a moment. "It's not that I don't want to. It's that most of it doesn't translate well into language." "Most of the hard things don't," she said. He looked at her then, the steady, 3-second look that she'd long since stopped finding unsettling. "The scar," he said. "I can see you looking at it sometimes." She held his gaze. "I'm not troubled by it." "I know you're not. That's—" He paused. "That's actually the thing I was going to say." She looked back at her book. Outside, the wind pressed at the cabin with its January persistence, and the fire moved in the draft from the chimney, and neither of them said anything for a while. And this was fine. It was on a Tuesday in late February that the first cabin burned. The Henderson homestead. Danny had been away, down at the Calloway place for the evening, the coincidence of which Eliza later came to believe was not a coincidence. He came home to a structure that had taken 20 years to build and had been reduced in a single night to a foundation and 2 standing walls and a smell that stayed in the surrounding snow for days. Danny arrived at Black Hollow 2 days later on a horse pushed past what was reasonable, and he came directly to Harlan's store and told Eliza what he'd found. His voice was steady. His hands were not. She put her hand on his arm, and he looked at it and then looked at the window and breathed slowly until the steadiness spread from his voice to the rest of him. "They burned it," he said. "They actually burned it." "I know," she said. "My father built that. I know, Danny." He looked at her. He was 19 years old and had been trying very hard for several months to be the kind of man who kept records and held his temper and trusted that documentation and patience would protect what his father had left him, and now he was looking at the ruins of that belief along with the ruins of his house. "What do I do?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "You come with me," she said. "Right now, up the mountain." She sent Cal ahead with a message, and by the time she and Danny reached Voss's cabin that afternoon, the fire was high, and there was already a 3rd cup on the table, which meant Voss had received the message and known they were coming, and had prepared for it without being asked. Voss listened to Danny's account from beginning to end without interrupting. When Danny finished, Voss said, "Were you able to identify anything before you left? Boot prints? Anything left behind?" "There were tracks," Danny said. "3 sets. They went north along the upper tree line." "North toward the Callaway land or north toward mine?" Danny thought. "Toward yours." Voss nodded once, the slow, conclusive nod of someone whose theory had just been confirmed by evidence. "Then they're escalating faster than I expected," he said. "They're not waiting for legal resolution." "What does that mean?" Danny said. Voss looked at him directly. "It means the legal strategy is still correct and still necessary. It also means it's not sufficient on its own anymore." He looked at Eliza. "We need the families together, all of them, here, within the week." "I can get them here," she said. "And we need to be very clear with them," he continued, "about what holding now actually means. Because up to this point, holding meant patience and documentation. After this," he stopped. "After this, it means something harder," she said. "Yes." Danny Henderson was looking at the fire with his jaw tight and his hands finally still. The cup in front of him was untouched and getting cold, but he didn't seem to notice. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I don't have a house to go back to, but I'm not leaving the land." Voss looked at him with something Eliza hadn't seen on his face, directed at anyone but her. A measured, quiet respect, the kind that doesn't announce itself. "I know," he said. "That's why we're going to figure this out." Outside, the February wind came down off the highest peaks with its full winter authority, shaking the pines and pressing at the heavy walls, and the 3 of them sat by the fire in the deep mountain cold and began to plan. The meeting happened 4 days after Danny Henderson arrived at Black Hollow, with his hands shaking and his house reduced to ash. Eliza had spent those 4 days moving between the mountain and town with a focused efficiency that left her body sore and her mind sharper than it had any right to be given how little she was sleeping. She rode to each homestead in sequence, delivered the same message in different registers depending on who she was talking to, straightforward with Marcus Morrow, careful with Jonas, direct and specific with Danny, who was staying in Voss's workshop until the question of his land was resolved. She also sent a letter to the circuit court in Brentville. She had drafted it 3 times before the language satisfied her, specific enough to establish the arson as connected to the property dispute, careful enough not to make claims she couldn't yet document. She cited the county filing irregularities, the Callaway note already on record, Danny Henderson's written account of the intimidation visits, and the destruction of the Henderson homestead. She sent it through Harlan, who sent it through the postal rider, and who looked at her across the store counter with the expression of a man watching someone do something he would not have the nerve to do himself. "You know, this might not reach anyone useful," he said. "It might not," she agreed, "but it's on record now. Which means if something else happens up there, it's part of a pattern and not an isolated incident." Harlan looked at the sealed envelope. "You've gotten very good at this very fast." "I've been paying attention for a long time," she said. "I just finally have something worth paying attention to." The families came to Voss's cabin on a Saturday. The Morrows together, Marcus and Clara leaving the children with a neighboring family from the lower trail. Jonas Callaway with his son supporting him on the steeper sections, the old man's lung audible in the cold air, but his expression leaving no doubt about his intentions. Danny already there, having not left since arriving. They arranged themselves around the main room with the pragmatic economy of people who were not accustomed to formal gatherings and didn't need them to function. Voss laid out the situation without softening it. The arson was deliberate and organized. The 3 sets of tracks Danny had identified matched a pattern consistent with hired men moving through the upper tree line to avoid the main trail. Hargrove had moved from pressure to destruction, which meant they were either operating on a shortened timeline or had calculated that the legal challenge was close enough to succeeding that they needed to act before the court responded. "Which is it?" Marcus Morrow asked. "Both, probably," Voss said. "The filing irregularities I documented are significant enough that a circuit court review is a real threat to their acquisition schedule. If the existing transfers get voided, the whole operation has to start over." "So they're scared," Danny said. "They're accelerating," Voss said, which was not quite the same thing. Scared companies make mistakes. Accelerating companies make dangerous ones. Jonas Calloway leaned forward in his chair. The rattle in his chest was worse in the cold interior despite the fire, and he had one hand pressed flat on the table in the way of someone managing pain without advertising it. "What do they do next?" he said. It was not a question. It was a request for Voss's actual assessment, delivered with the directness of a man who had long since stopped having patience for uncertainty, dressed up as strategy. Voss looked at him. "They come up here with enough men to make the point that the legal process is slower than they are." The room was quiet for a moment. Clara Morrow said, "How many men?" "I don't know. Enough to be convincing." He paused. "They won't necessarily try to burn everything. Burning creates evidence, and they've already done more of that than is smart. They're more likely to try to take physical control of access points. Block the trails. Make it functionally impossible to hold the land even if you legally own it." "Which means we need to control the access points first," Eliza said. Everyone looked at her. She had been standing near the window, a position she'd taken without thinking and had kept because it gave her a view of both the room and the upper trail approach outside. She moved to the table where the survey map was still spread out, the annotated coal seam line running through all their futures. "We know these trails better than they do," she said. "We know where the terrain helps us and where it doesn't. We know where the choke points are." She looked at Voss. "You've been moving around this mountain for 6 years. You know every place where a small group of people could slow a larger one down." "Yes," he said. "Then we use that." She looked around the room, at Marcus's set jaw, at Clara's careful eyes, at Jonas's hand flat on the table, at Danny's barely contained readiness. "We don't meet them in the open. We make this mountain as difficult to move through as possible, and we make sure that by the time anyone gets near these homesteads, they've used up enough time and certainty that holding looks more costly than leaving." She paused. "And we document every step of it, so that when the circuit court letter comes back, we have a full account of what they did and what we did in response." Marcus Morrow looked at his wife. Clara gave a short, small nod that seemed to settle something between them. "All right," Marcus said. "Tell us what you need." The planning took the rest of that day and part of the next. Voss knew the terrain with the comprehensive intimacy of someone who had walked it in every season and weather, and he was methodical about communicating what he knew. Not in the way of someone performing competence, but in the way of someone transferring information as efficiently as possible. He identified 4 natural choke points on the main access trails, 2 secondary approaches that hired men coming from the south would likely use once the main trails were fortified, and 3 positions in the upper rock faces where the terrain itself, the slope angles, the loose shale, would slow movement to nearly nothing. Eliza took notes. She also drew her own version of Voss's verbal descriptions on a second piece of paper, turning his spatial knowledge into something that all 5 adults in the room could read and remember, and she did this without announcing that she was doing it, simply because it was the useful thing to do. Jonas's son, 24-year-old Reed Calloway, turned out to have a specific and practical knowledge of the upper snowpack. He'd been managing the Calloway property's winter risk for 3 years and had an informal but accurate sense of where the snow sat unstable on the high slopes above the secondary approaches. He described 2 sections where the weight was wrong, where the accumulation on the upper ridgeline had built without the usual settling. He said this matter-of-factly, the way people say things that are simply observations to them and have not yet registered as tactically significant. Voss and Eliza looked at each other across the table. "How certain are you about those sections?" Voss said to Reed. Reed thought about it. "Pretty certain about the eastern one. The western I'd want to check again, but it was bad last week." "Don't touch them," Voss said. "Don't go near them. Don't let your livestock near them. Leave them exactly as they are." Reed looked at him, and then at Eliza, and then back, and the significance resolved in his face. He didn't say anything, just nodded once. They dispersed on Sunday morning with a plan and a set of signals, a mirror arrangement Voss had used on his own property for years, angles that would carry message light between the homesteads faster than any rider could move on winter trails. Each family knew their role. Each family knew what to watch for. What none of them could fully prepare for was how fast it happened. The men came on a Wednesday, 12 days after the Henderson cabin burned. Eliza was at the Morrow homestead when the first mirror signal came from the Callaway Junction. Reed's reflection off the upper rocks, two long flashes that meant movement on the southern approach, which was the secondary trail Voss had identified. She had her coat on and was outside before the second set of flashes finished. "Clara," she said, coming back through the door, "get the children to the root cellar. Now, not in a minute." Clara didn't argue. She had 3 children moving toward the cellar door in under 30 seconds, with the efficiency of a woman who had been quietly preparing for this for 12 days. Eliza rode hard up the trail to Voss's property, pushing the mare faster than was safe on the packed snow, and arrived to find him already outside with his rifle and a look that told her the mirror signals from the upper ridge had reached him first. Danny was there too, having spent the intervening days rebuilding what he could of a temporary shelter on his own land during the days and returning to Voss's workshop at night. "Southern approach," Eliza said, dismounting. "I know. Also the main trail from the look of it. Reed's been signaling from the upper rock for the past 10 minutes. He looked at the southern tree line, then at the main trail below. They split the approach. 2 groups. "How many in total?" "Reed counted at least 8 on the south trail. The main trail group I haven't had a count on yet. 8 men, plus an unknown number on the main approach. Against Voss, Danny, Marcus Morrow, who would be moving to his position now if the signals had reached him. Jonas Callaway, who had no business being out in this cold with his lung, but who would be there anyway, Reed and herself. The numbers were not comforting. "The eastern snowpack," she said. "If they take the secondary pass route, yes. If they stay on the main south trail, they'll take the pass route," she said. "It's faster, and they don't know the snowpack. They're not from here." He looked at her. "Voss, they are not from here. They won't know to avoid it." He looked at the southern ridge for a long moment, with the expression she had learned to read as him calculating odds, costs, and consequences simultaneously. "The pass route takes them under the eastern section," he said. "If they move through in a group—" "Yes," she said. He handed her the rifle without another word and went to the barn for what he needed. What happened in the next 2 hours was not the clean, decisive sequence that people sometimes construct afterward when they need the story to make sense. It was cold and loud and full of the particular confusion of people trying to coordinate across distance without reliable communication. The mirror signals helped until the cloud cover came in and killed the light around mid-morning, and after that it was sound and proximity, and whoever could move fastest on terrain they knew. The South Approach Group, 9 men, as it turned out, took the pass route. Eliza had been right about that. They moved fast, confident in their numbers, and they did not avoid the eastern snowpack because they had no reason to think they needed to. Reed Callaway, watching from the high rocks above, later said the sound was less dramatic than he'd expected. A low concussion, more felt than heard, and then the slope coming down across the pass in a rolling mass that wasn't the catastrophic wall of mountain stories, but was more than enough to block the route completely and send 9 men scrambling back the way they'd come, with considerably less confidence than they'd arrived with. 3 of the main trail group got as far as Voss's fence line before Voss appeared on the other side of it. He did not need to say anything. He stood at the fence with the complete, contained stillness of a man who had decided exactly what he was willing to do and was entirely comfortable with that decision, and he looked at the 3 men with the expression that had driven off every unwanted visitor to his land for 6 years, and 2 of the 3 stopped. The third one kept moving. He pushed through the fence gate and raised what he was carrying, and Voss moved, fast, much faster than a man his size had any right to move. And what happened in the next 15 seconds resulted in the man on the ground and the thing he'd been carrying in Voss's hands, and Voss bleeding from a cut above his left eye that was producing more blood than the wound strictly warranted, but was not, as far as Eliza could determine when she reached them, serious. Voss didn't go down. That was the thing she carried with her afterward. He was bleeding and had clearly taken a significant blow to the same side as the scar, and he was still standing, still present, still the same degree of controlled as he had been before it happened. But then he went to one knee. It was not dramatic. He simply was standing, and then he was not. And she was there, and she caught his arm before he went further, and he let her, which she understood was the most significant thing that had happened in the past 2 hours. Not the snowpack, not the men at the fence, the fact that Garrick Voss let her hold his arm and didn't try to immediately stand back up. How bad? She said. I'll be up in a minute, he said. That's not what I asked. He looked up at her from the kneeling position, the scar dark against his pale face, the blood from the cut above his eye already slowing. Ribs, he said. 2, maybe. I'll be up in a minute. She kept her hand on his arm. Around them, the 2 men who had stopped were backing away toward the trail with the uncoordinated haste of people who have just comprehensively reassessed their situation. The 3rd man was sitting in the snow with the expression of someone whose morning had not gone the way he'd expected. Marcus, she called, because Marcus Morrow had come up on the main trail during the confrontation and was 20 yards behind her. Take this one and hold him somewhere. He's not going anywhere. Marcus came forward and did this without argument, which meant the morning had reached the point where people were simply responding to whoever was directing things, and the person directing things was Eliza Boone. She got Voss inside. She was not gentle about it because gentle would have taken twice as long, and he was not comfortable about it because accepting help was not something his body did with any grace. He sat in the chair by the fire, and she looked at his ribs with the practical, unapologetic assessment of someone who had seen injured people before and was not going to pretend this was happening in a drawing room. Breathe, she said. He breathed, winced. 2, he confirmed. Can you ride? Not today. Then you're staying here, she said, and I'm finishing this. He looked at her. Eliza? The southern group is blocked and scattered, she said, pulling on her coat. Marcus has the 1 man, the other 2 from the main trail are running. I need to get to the Calloways and the Morrow homestead, confirm everyone is accounted for, and make sure we have written statements from Reed and Danny before anyone's memory starts softening. She looked at him directly. You're injured. I'm not. I know every route on this mountain now. I know where everyone is. I will be back before dark. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds. Not the assessing look of earlier months, but something different. Something that was in the territory of a man watching someone he had deeply underestimated. Except that was not quite right either, because she thought he had stopped underestimating her some time ago. Take the mare, he said. She knows the trails better than any of the others. I know, she said, and went. The rest of that day was cold and exhausting and not triumphant in any clean sense. Jonas Calloway had in fact been out on the upper rocks with Reed despite his lung, and he was paying for it by evening, shaking with cold, the rattle in his chest worse than she'd heard it, his son and daughter-in-law getting him settled with the grim efficiency of people who had done this before and would probably do it again. Clara Morrow had been in the root cellar with her children for 3 hours, and was steady when she came out, but held the youngest with a grip that didn't relax for the rest of the day. Danny Henderson had been at his land the entire time, alone at the temporary shelter he'd built, and had watched the South Trail from above with no way to communicate once the clouds came in, and the expression on his face when Eliza rode up and told him it was over was one she thought she would carry for a long time. Not relief exactly, but something that relief looked like on a 19-year-old who had been holding too much alone for too long. She got back to Voss's cabin as the light failed. He was at the table, not by the fire, which meant he had moved while she was gone and was now pretending he hadn't. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Everyone's accounted for, she said. Written statements from Reed and Danny. Marcus is holding the 1 man in the Morrow barn. We'll need to figure out what to do with him, but he's not going anywhere tonight. The southern group is gone. They took the western trail down, and they won't be comfortable for a day or 2. She set her coat on the hook by the door. I've sent another letter to the circuit court through Harlan's rider. This one has specific names, specific dates, and a first-hand account of today signed by 4 people. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You're extraordinary, you know. It came out without the careful deliberation that usually preceded anything he said that mattered, and he seemed to notice this, seemed to register that the sentence had left his mouth without the usual processing time, but he didn't retract it. He looked at the table. Eliza stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. At the bandaged ribs visible through the open shirt he hadn't fully fastened yet, at the dried blood on the left side of his face, at the hands flat on the table in the posture that meant he was working something out. You need to sleep, she said. Both of us do. Yes, he said. Tomorrow, we figure out the rest of it. Yes, he said again. She took the chair by the fire, and the mountain pressed its cold weight against the cabin walls, and outside the dark was absolute and complete. The man they had captured, the one Marcus had held in the Morrow barn through the night, turned out to be more useful than anyone had anticipated, though not in the way that useful usually looked. His name was Cord Elias, and he was 31 years old and had been hired in Brentville 3 weeks earlier by an intermediary he knew only as Prentice, who had told him the job was property enforcement and paid 3 times what a working man made in a month. Cord Elias had not asked enough questions about what property enforcement meant in practical terms, and now he was sitting in a barn in the Bitterstone Mountains with 2 broken fingers from the previous day's events, and a growing awareness that the people he'd been hired to intimidate had significantly better documentation of recent events than the people who'd hired him. Eliza sat across from him on a hay bale the morning after the assault and asked him questions in the same patient, non-theatrical way she asked most questions. And Cord Elias, down, cold, injured, and possessed of the specific clarity that comes to men who have recently made bad decisions and are now calculating what the next decision should be, answered them. Not everything, and not immediately, but enough. The name Prentice, the location in Brentville where the group had been assembled, the name of the man above Prentice, which Cord had overheard once and had not been meant to hear. That name was Aldous Greer. He was a senior partner in Hargrove Land Syndicate, and he had been careful enough to keep his name off every document filed in every county recorder's office in the territory, but he had not been careful enough to keep it out of a conversation that a hired man with good ears had been standing near. Eliza wrote it down. She sent Cord Elias down to Black Hollow with Marcus Morrow and a written account of his testimony, signed by himself in exchange for her word that she would tell the circuit court he had cooperated. She was not certain her word carried legal weight in any official sense. She said it anyway because it was the truth about what she would do, and because a person who only made promises they were certain would be honored ended up making very few promises and accomplishing very little. Marcus looked at her before he rode out, Cord Elias beside him on a borrowed horse. "You think this is enough," Marcus said. "I think it's enough to make Hargrove's position significantly more expensive than continuing it," she said, "which is what enough means in this situation." He rode out. She went back up the mountain. Voss's ribs were too cracked, not broken, a distinction that mattered for movement, if not for discomfort. He had the contained, slightly irritable quality of a man who healed well but disliked the process, and he was at the workbench by the second morning, despite her suggestion that he wasn't, because the bench work was something he could do without using his torso excessively, and because sitting still made him worse rather than better. She had stopped arguing about it by the 3rd day and simply worked at the table while he worked at the bench, and they communicated across the room about the filings, the testimony, the letter to the circuit court, the next steps. The circuit court response came 12 days later, carried up from Black Hollow by Harlan's postal rider who had been given specific instructions to deliver it to Eliza Boone directly rather than leaving it at the store. It was not the decisive legal triumph that people in stories received at moments like this. It was a formal notice of preliminary review, which meant the court had found sufficient grounds to examine the contested transfers and had issued a temporary stay on any further property transactions in the affected areas pending that examination. It was, in the language of territorial law, a beginning rather than an end, but beginnings were what they needed. Eliza read the notice twice, then set it on the table in front of Voss without comment. He read it, set it down, looked at it. "It holds them," he said. "It holds them legally while the review proceeds," she said, "which means any further physical action on their part happens in the context of an active court examination. The risk calculation changes." Greer's name in the testimony. Yes, that's the part that matters most. She sat down. A man who has kept his name off documents for 8 months is not a man who wants his name on documents. Once it's in a formal court record, she stopped, because Voss was nodding and she didn't need to finish. "How long does the review take?" he said. "Months, possibly longer." She looked at him. "But the families have legal standing now. They can't be quietly pressured out from under an active court examination." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the late February wind had the quality of something that was thinking about becoming March. Still cold, but differently cold, with a faint edge of future to it that pure winter didn't have. "Danny's land," he said. Yes. The Henderson homestead was the unresolved piece. The land was Danny's, clear and documented, but the cabin was gone. That's a different problem. Not insurmountable. No, she agreed. Not insurmountable. They looked at the notice on the table between them, and she thought about the word insurmountable, about all the things she had believed were exactly that, in the specific way that a person believes something is impossible when they have been told long enough that they are not the kind of person capable of dealing with it. The 14 months since the wedding had felt, from the inside, like proof of that belief, like evidence that the town was right about her, and Thomas Caldwell had been right about her, and the general consensus that she was not quite enough of whatever was required had been based on accurate assessment. She had been wrong about that. She knew it now, not as a declaration or a revelation, but simply as a fact she could look at plainly, the way you look at a survey map and see the land as it actually is, rather than as someone described it to you. She had come up this mountain because she needed the money. She had stayed because it turned out that what she was good at, paying attention, asking the right questions, moving between people, and earning their actual trust, seeing the whole picture, and understanding how the pieces connected, was exactly what this situation required. Not despite her being who she was. Because of it. That was not the lesson exactly. The lesson was more uncomfortable than that. The lesson was that she had been capable of all of this for years before the mountain, before Voss, before Hargrove and coal seams and circuit court notices. She had been this person in Black Hollow, sitting in her room above the store, and she had not had the occasion to find it out. She did not romanticize this. The occasion had been other people's crises, other people's threatened land, a man who burned easily with a bad lung, and a boy who'd lost his father's house. The occasion had been brutal and cold and not fair. But that was how it usually worked, she thought. You didn't find out what you were made of when things were going well. You found out when the weather closed in and the decision had to be made and nobody more qualified was available. Voss spoke. You're thinking about something. Yes, she said. Are you going to tell me what? She looked at him. He was watching her from the workbench with the attention he gave things that mattered, which was different from the attention he gave things that didn't, and she had learned to tell the difference. I'm thinking that I spent 14 months in Black Hollow believing I was exactly what that town thought I was, she said, and I'm thinking that was the most expensive mistake I've ever made. He was quiet for a moment. What changed? I got on a horse and came up a mountain to do a job, she said. That's all. Everything else followed from that. He set down what he was working on, a deliberate, unhurried motion. The town was wrong about you, he said, for whatever that's worth from me. It's worth something, she said. Coming from you, specifically. The spring review took 4 months, which was faster than expected, and what it produced was not a complete dismantling of Hargrove's operation, but something more specific and in some ways more damaging. 2 of the 3 existing transfers were voided on the boundary description errors Voss had identified, with restitution ordered to the original sellers who had, as he'd suspected, been significantly underpaid. Aldous Greer was named in the court record as a principal party, which had the effect of making him very expensive to insure and very difficult to partner with for the foreseeable future. The Hargrove Land Syndicate did not formally dissolve. These things rarely collapsed cleanly. But the Eastern Territories operation shuttered, the Brentville Intermediary Network disappeared, and the Circuit Court's public record stood as a permanent account of what had been attempted and how it had been stopped. Danny Henderson built a new cabin with help. This is the part of the story that people in Black Hollow, when they eventually heard the full version, always wanted to know about, the rebuilding, because it was concrete in a way that legal proceedings were not. Voss provided timber from the upper forest on his property, cut and hauled with the methodical labor of a man who understood that certain debts were paid in wood and sweat rather than money. Marcus Morrow spent 3 weeks on the build. Reed Calloway came up when his own work permitted. Even Jonas, when his lung allowed him a decent week, sat at the construction site and gave opinions about joinery that nobody had asked for and that were, despite this, almost always correct. Danny Henderson was 20 years old by the time the cabin was finished and had the quality now of someone who had been through something that had cost him significantly but had not taken the things it had been aimed at. He was quieter than before. But it was a different kind of quiet, less like barely contained pressure, and more like the quiet of someone who had learned to distinguish between situations that required immediate response and situations that required waiting. He thanked Eliza for this once, at the end of a long workday when they were both tired enough that formality wasn't available. He said, "You told me not to react when they wanted me to react. I almost didn't listen." "Almost," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Almost." She thought about that for a while afterward, about the specific discipline of not reacting, about how it ran contrary to everything that felt right in the moment of injustice, about how it was also the thing that had preserved his claim and his standing and ultimately his land. Nobody taught you that. You either learned it from someone who had, or you learned it from losing something, and sometimes you learned it both ways. She had learned it from losing something. She did not recommend this method, but she was also not sure any other method stuck as well. The news from Black Hollow changed in quality over the spring and summer, slowly and imperfectly, the way towns change. Not through any one event, but through an accumulation of revised assessments. The story of the Henderson arson and what followed it moved through the town the way stories did, gaining detail and occasionally accuracy. And what emerged from the various retellings was a version of events in which Eliza Boone had stood in the gap between a powerful company and a group of mountain families and had not moved. This was not how she would have described it. She would have described it as figuring out what needed to be done and then doing those specific things, which was less dramatic but more accurate. But she had long since understood that the version of a story that traveled was never quite the same as the version that had been lived, and she had made her peace with the distance between the two. Clara Morrow said something to her that summer that she thought about for a long time. They were sitting on the Morrow porch on a warm evening, the kind of evening that the Bitterstone Mountains occasionally produced in July, as if to compensate for 7 months of cold. And Clara said, "You know what I think was the most important thing you did?" "Tell me," Eliza said. "You didn't try to make us feel safe," Clara said. "You gave us information and let us decide. Most people, when they're trying to help, they want to manage what you feel about the situation. You didn't do that." Eliza looked at the mountain in the evening light. "I didn't know enough to promise safety," she said, "so I gave you what I knew." "That's what I mean," Clara said. There was a version of events in which the people of Black Hollow underwent a collective transformation, in which the town that had mocked Eliza Boone for 14 months experienced a fundamental change of heart and welcomed her back as one of their own. This was not quite what happened, because towns are composed of individuals who change at their own speeds and for their own reasons, and collective transformation was more the language of sermons than of actual human behavior. What happened was more scattered and real than that. Some people in Black Hollow simply stopped saying certain things. Some people who had been careful to avoid her were less careful about it. And in the space that opened up, a few actual conversations happened, and from those conversations, occasionally, something adjacent to respect. The women at the dry goods counter who had been finding reasons to look away started looking back. Not all of them, not always, but enough that the quality of the room changed when she entered it. The girl who had said she would rather die than end up like Eliza Boone had left town by then, gone east to marry someone, and so was not available to revise her opinion. Eliza did not spend much time thinking about this. What she spent time thinking about that summer was Voss. The thing between them had been building with the same slow, unannounced accumulation as the winter snowpack, present in each individual moment in amounts that seemed unremarkable, adding up to something significant before either of them had formally acknowledged the process. She was on the mountain 3 or 4 days a week by then, not for supply runs, but because the work of the legal proceedings required coordination, and because Danny's rebuild required coordination, and because she and Voss had developed a working relationship that had long since passed the point where professional necessity fully explained it. He was not easy. She wanted to be clear about this, even in her own thinking. He was still the man who used silence the way other people used words, who assessed everything at a distance before committing to it, who carried 6 years of deliberate solitude as a habit that didn't dissolve just because circumstances had changed. There were days when the gap between what he was thinking and what he said out loud was wide enough to be genuinely frustrating, and she told him so once, directly, and he had looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as genuine surprise. not at the criticism, but at the fact of being told plainly by someone who was not angry about it. "You could just say what you mean," she said. "I'm not going to run." "I know," he said. "Then, it's habit," he said, "not intention." He paused. "I'm working on it." She believed him because she had been watching him work on things for months, and she knew what it looked like. Slow, incremental, without drama, but real. He was also the man who had sent her up the safe fork in the trail the first time she came to his land, and who had given her a coat without being asked, and who had said she was extraordinary in the unguarded moment when he wasn't performing anything. He was the man who read Whistler's Ridge twice, and understood exactly which part was very good and why. He was the man who had knelt in the snow with cracked ribs and let her hold his arm, which she understood was the kind of thing that costs certain people more than it costs others. There was, she thought, no uncomplicated version of him. There was just the actual version, which was scarred and solitary and capable of real violence, and also careful with other people's things, and honest to a degree that sometimes landed wrong, and possessed of a quality of attention that, once it was directed at you fully, was unlike anything she had previously experienced. She was not interested in uncomplicated. She had spent her whole life being offered the uncomplicated version of what she was supposed to want, and finding it insufficient. He asked her in September. Not with ceremony, Garrick Voss was not a man of ceremony, but in the specific, serious way he did things that mattered to him. They were at the table after a long day of finalizing the last of the court documentation, papers spread between them, the fire lower than it should have been because neither of them had remembered to add wood in the past 2 hours. He set down his pen and looked at her and said, without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She looked up from her notes. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said, "not because I should, and not because it makes practical sense, though it does, because you are the most capable and honest person I've met in my life, and because being in this room with you is the closest thing to not being alone I've experienced in longer than I can accurately account for, and because I'd rather ask and have you say no than not ask and spend the rest of whatever this is wondering what you would have said." She looked at him for a long time. He held her gaze without flinching, which cost him something, she could tell, and he did it anyway. The room was quiet. Outside, the early September mountain had the last warmth of the year in it, the evenings still light longer than they would be next month. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath, slow, controlled, and she thought that this was probably the closest to visibly relieved she had ever seen him, and she thought that was all right, that there was nothing wrong with a man being relieved that the answer was yes. "I want to stay on the mountain," she said. "I'm not going back to live in Black Hollow." "I didn't ask you to go back to Black Hollow. And I want to keep running supplies to the families. It matters." "I never thought it didn't." She looked at him. "You understand I'm going to keep telling you when you're not saying what you mean." Something at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but the reliable precursor to one. "I assumed that was not negotiable." "It is not," she said. What the mountain became, over the years that followed, was not a transformation in the story sense, not a wilderness that became a paradise, not a community that sprang up perfectly formed from the resolution of a crisis. It was something slower and more honest than that. More families came to the Eastern Ridge as word spread that the land was held and the legal record stood, and the trails that Eliza had memorized through a winter of supply runs became roads used by more than just her. The Calloway family expanded. Danny Henderson married at 23, a woman from the Brentville area who had heard the story of the Henderson cabin and had apparently found it compelling. Jonas Calloway's lung held for 2 more winters before it didn't, and he died in his own house on his own land in January of the 3rd year, which was what he had asked for, and which was what he got. Eliza thought about him sometimes when she was on the upper trails. The specific quality of his presence, the hand flat on the table, the 12 words that told you exactly where you stood. She thought there was something worth remembering in the way he had lived, not without fear, but without letting the fear make the decisions. He had been afraid those months of the Hargrove campaign. She had seen it in the tight set of his jaw and the flatness of his responses when she brought him difficult information. He had been afraid, and he had stayed anyway, and he had signed his name to documents and held his land and died where he intended to. That was not nothing. In fact, it was most of what mattered. The story that Black Hollow eventually settled on, the version that traveled furthest and lasted longest, was about a mountain man everyone feared and a woman nobody wanted, and how together they had faced down a company that thought it could buy the Bitterstone Range out from under its people. This version was not wrong exactly, but it was simplified in the way that all stories simplify, and what it lost in the simplification was the part Eliza thought was most true. It was not that they had been unlikely heroes who rose to an occasion. It was that they had been two people who had been told, in different ways and for different reasons, that they were not quite the right kind of person, too big, too scarred, too difficult, too much, and who had both, quietly and without making a declaration of it, refused to accept that verdict. Not through a single dramatic choice, but through 100 small ones. The choice to come up the mountain when everyone expected her to stay in town. The choice to stay when common sense suggested leaving. The choice to ask the right question even when the answer was going to be complicated. The choice to hold someone's arm when they needed holding and not make it more than it was. What the Bitterstone Mountains produced, in the end, was not a legend in the grand sense. It was something more durable than that. It was a place where people had held what was theirs because they had chosen each other over the easier alternative of going it alone, and where two people who had been defined their entire lives by what others said they lacked had found, in each other and in the work they did together, sufficient evidence that the definition was wrong. The mountain didn't care about any of this. It kept its own time and its own weather, entirely indifferent to the small human things happening in its shadow. Eliza had understood this from the first trip up, the cold moving off the peaks with that absolute impersonal quality. Not hostile, just true. The mountain would be here after all of them were gone. The snow would cover the trails, and the trails would reopen, and the families would age, and their children would take over, and the coal seam would sit under the eastern ridge, untouched, for whatever came next. But right now, in this particular September, in a cabin built to last on a shelf of granite above the tree line, there was a fire that needed wood, and the papers on the table were finally, fully done. And the woman who had once stood in a church waiting for a man who never came through the door was sitting across from the man she had chosen, and he had chosen her. And outside the light was going the particular gold that September evenings went in the mountains. And this, she thought, imperfect and hard-won and fully real, was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. It was everything.